The country that I represent today is a country that needs your help, and the reason I'm here is to ask for your help. It's a country that you've almost certainly never heard of. It's called the Good Country. And as the lady says, no matter how good your geography is, you probably couldn't point to it on a map, and that's because it's nowhere to be found except arguably in your heart. And it does need your help. So what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to tell you briefly the story of the Good Country, where it came from, where it is now, and where it's hoping to go. And then I will make an appeal. So you've been warned. 5 minutes before I finish, that's the time to leave. So it all started because for quite a few years I'd been doing a job which I enjoyed very much. It was quite an unusual job. I was advising the governments of countries around the world as a kind of independent foreign policy advisor. And I tended to specialize in heads of state and heads of government. And that was what made it such an interesting job. Over the 20 years or so, I advised, I think, 53 different countries. And working with the people who run countries and having very intimate conversations with them about their country's future in the world and their vision for their country, these were fascinating discussions. But over the years, I began to realize that they always seemed to go the same way. And they always ended up in a kind of cul-de-sac. So the advice I was giving was all about what I used to call, and still call, engagement. It's about how countries can connect more productively with the rest of the international system, with other countries, with the multilateral organizations, with powerful individuals, with not so powerful individuals, with corporations, and so forth, to try to make a better globalization than the one that we'd had before. And the conversations were often good, and many, many interesting suggestions would come up out of our conversations about imaginative and courageous ways that countries could link with other countries and do things that benefited themselves and benefited the whole system. But 99 times out of 100, if I'm honest, the suggestions that came up were never implemented. And the reason they weren't implemented was not because they wouldn't have worked. It wasn't because they were particularly expensive or difficult or troublesome or challenging in those senses. It was because this thing always got in the way. And the thing that always got in the way was the national interest. This absolute fixation amongst governments all over the world, whatever their political stripe, that anything you do that's good for your people is probably going to be bad for the rest of the planet. And anything that's good for the rest of humanity is probably not going to be in the interests of your people. It's not true, it's not correct. This viewpoint is very easily demolished in a half-hour lecture, but the fact of the matter is that all governments seem to believe that you're either a nationalist or a globalist, and you can't be both. And harmonizing the domestic agenda with the international agenda, harmonizing the needs of your population with the needs of humanity, and especially future generations of humanity, it can't be done. They are so wrong. There are so many policies yet out there that haven't been made but could be made that harmonize most beautifully the internal affairs of countries and the international agenda, and they just haven't been tried yet. And I tried. I tried for 20 years with 53 different countries, with pretty good access to the top decision makers. And I worked my heart out, traveling the world, trying to think of the best, most courageous, most imaginative policies I could, thinking, surely this time they'll get it. They'll understand that this is not just good for the world, it's good for them. And I failed, and I failed, and I failed, and I failed, and eventually I gave up. I thought to myself, traditional countries with territory and history and politics and government and populations, they're never going to be able to do this. And I thought, how can I start to get this debate out into the public domain where it can really start to produce some results? Because what we're looking at here is not a change in the structures or the systems of global governance, it's a change in the culture. Because the fundamental culture of government around the world is pretty much the same today as it was when the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. Jules? 1683, or thereabouts. In other words, that the nations of the earth are competing, warring tribes, and their purpose is to seize advantage from each other. And the culture of governance, therefore, is one fundamentally of competition, competing states. And there's been traditionally a single mandate for people in a position of power, which says you are responsible for your own people and your own slice of territory. And if in order to do the right thing for your own people and your own slice of territory, you do some harm to other people's people or other people's territory, then that makes you a particularly strong leader. This cannot work any longer. In fact, it's never really worked, because life on Earth is a team sport. It's not a sprint to the finish. If America comes first and we all come last, then even America won't benefit from that for very long, because there won't be anybody to trade with. It's not a sprint to the finish. It is a team game, and it's a team game that goes on for generation after generation. So in the modern age, in the age of globalization, we need to replace that traditional mandate of governance with what I call the dual mandate. And the dual mandate couldn't be simpler or more childish. It basically says, if you're in a position of power and authority, you are responsible for your own people, yes, and for every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether you like it or not. You are responsible for your own slice of territory, yes, and for every inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, you probably shouldn't be in a position of power and responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that nations have to become self-sacrificing. That would be absurd. I don't think there's anything odd or particularly unusual or even provocative when Donald J. Trump says America first. That's the most boring, obvious thing for a head of state or a head of government to say. It's what every head of state and every head of government has pretty much said since the Treaty of Westphalia and long before. Of course, if you're elected to run your country, you have to put that country's interests first. But what I find a little bit demoralizing about Donald Trump is the assumption that goes with that America first means everybody else last. And about this, he is wrong. It's a failure of the imagination. We can all come first if we learn how to make policy in a different way, and if we can change the fundamental culture of governance that underpins the community of nations. Now, that's a very, very steep challenge. I'm very well aware of that. To talk glibly about changing the culture of governance worldwide is almost funny, because how do you do that? Well, one thing is for sure, that it's an awful lot easier than changing the structure. And I, like an awful number of people, have wasted many happy years of my life exploring ways in which the international community could be better structured, better organized, a new kind of United Nations for the age of globalization. But the problem with those discussions is that structures and systems never change before the culture changes. The culture has to change first, and then the systems change, because they must. Okay, that's the end of the theoretical part. The rest is a story, so it's a bit easier for me to tell, and I hope a bit easier for you to listen to. So I decided that I wanted to try and get some of this debate into the public domain. And I discovered through previous experiences that if you publish a ranking, then people get very engaged. And it's taking advantage of people's natural sense of national competition. Of course, they want to see where their country ranks, and they want to see where the country they don't like ranks. And so I had an idea which struck me at the time as being absurdly childish, which is always a good reason for doing something. And I thought of it as a ranking of all the nations in the world based on how much they contribute or take away to the rest of the system outside their own borders. Now, as you probably know, as you certainly know, there are dozens, hundreds of rankings, of indexes out there that measure the performance of countries. But they all have one thing in common, which is they look inwards and they measure the performance of that country domestically, as if it were an island alone in the middle of a vast ocean, which is not the way that the world works. We are massively interconnected and massively interdependent. The world is a single system, and to treat countries as if you could separate them from each other, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work culturally, it doesn't work socially, it doesn't work economically, it doesn't work politically, it doesn't work historically. And nobody had ever thought to measure, to do a kind of balance sheet for the countries of the world, so that you could at a glance say, country Y is a net creditor to humanity. Country B is a debtor. We should feel glad that country C exists, because it contributes to the world that all of us live in. We should be worried about country, what letter haven't I used yet, J, because it's a free rider on the global system and it takes more than it gives and it needs to change. So that was the Good Country Index. And I started working on it with my colleague Robert Govers in 2012. By 2014, it was kind of ready to publish. And I was invited by TED to give a TED talk at the same time, so I thought, wonderful opportunity to launch the Good Country Index with a bit of a bang. So I used this TED event in Berlin, and I was very, very excited about being able to give a TED talk, because I'd never done one before. And there's a very good friend of mine who's given several TED talks, and he knows all about TED. He spends quite a lot of his time studying the numbers. He's made a huge spreadsheet of which talks do well and why, and all the rest of it. He has a lot of spare time. And so when I was asked to do this TED talk, of course, he was the first person I called, and I said, Daniel, am I going to get 57 million views? And he said, no. I said, how can you be so sure? And he said, well, because the way I see it is that there are basically two kinds of TED talk. There are the interesting ones, and there are the boring ones. And yours is going to be one of the boring ones. And I said, why? That's really mean. And he said, well, because it's the subject matter. You see, you're moaning about the state of the world. And the TED Talks that moan about the state of the world, they don't do very well. In fact, and I could hear over the phone his finger going down his spreadsheet. The moaning about the state of the world talk that's done best so far got 120,000 views. So you might, if it's really good, get 120,000 views. So I said, oh, well, that would be great. Let's hope for the best. I was bitterly disappointed before I even gave the talk. But I gave it anyway, and it seemed to go quite well. And I talked about the Good Country Index, and I announced the fact that rather unexpectedly, Ireland had come top. It was the country which, in the first edition of the Good Country Index, relative to the size of its economy, had given more to the world outside its own borders than any other country on the planet. And I wound up, having announced this fact, by saying, what does that mean? That means that all of us, when we go to bed at night, in the last 30 seconds before we drift off to sleep, we might be saying to ourselves, thank God that Ireland exists. This got a big round of applause. And thank you so much. It's the data, don't thank me. And so I thought, well, that went pretty well. Maybe I will get 120,000 views, or maybe even 125. And the video duly went up on the internet, on TED's website. And I had a call from TED about 24 hours after it had gone up. And I thought, ooh, they're calling me. Either something went wrong, I have to do the talk again, or... and they said, the numbers are really good, Simon. I said, you don't mean that I'm on my way to 120,000? They said, no, you made 120,000 in the first 4 hours. And I said, oh, so why are you calling me? And they said, because your talk was the fastest to 1 million views that we've ever had. And I thought, okay, listen, I'm not telling this story to brag much, but mainly because of what happened as a result of it and what that appreciation of the talk showed me. It's just past, it's on its way to 5.5 million views now. This was 4 years ago, and it just keeps on going. And it's a boring talk, me moaning about the state of the world and giving some results of an out-of-date index. Ireland is no longer #1, but we can talk about that later. What was even more interesting than that was the fact that I started getting huge numbers of emails. And my family started getting quite worried about me because I've got a problem. I cannot ignore a communication that's directed at me. I've never been able to learn how to do that. And so I was sitting up 18 hours a day answering thousands upon thousands of crazy emails from crazy people all over the world. Actually, literally every single country on Earth. But I didn't mind because almost all of them were incredibly positive. And let me tell you about those emails. Over the first 2.5, 3 years, I received 18,000 of them. And they were saying things that touched me. First of all, they were saying, love the talk, I really agree with what you're saying, I feel that way about my country, I wish my country could be more good, good the opposite of selfish, not good the opposite of bad, that it could do more for the global community, that would make me feel more proud than being just a successful country. So they said all that, but then a lot of them started telling me about themselves in a really quite personal way. And a lot of them were saying things like, I don't know why, but when I was a kid, I just sort of naturally grew up with the idea that foreigners, people from other countries, were always going to be more interesting than people from my own country. And I thought everybody was like that, but I've gradually discovered that actually I've never really met anybody else who sees it that way, and I wonder why. And you seem to see it that way, which is why I'm writing to you. A lot of them said, I don't know why, but I always thought that other people's countries would be more interesting and more worth visiting than my own country. And I thought everybody was like that, and I discovered that I'm the only person I ever met who feels that way. But you seem to feel that way, so that's why I'm writing to you. A lot of them said things like, I don't know why, but I've always felt that I was a member of the human race first and a citizen of my own nation second. And you seem to think like that, and that's why I'm writing to you. And a lot of them also said, I'm really, really, really frustrated with domestic politics. The politicians in my country who seem like overgrown school children squabbling about tiny political issues, domestic political issues, and outside the planet is on fire and people are killing each other and they don't even talk about it. And I'm worried, who's looking after the big stuff? Who's making sure that there'll be a planet for our children to live on? The United Nations, but they don't seem to have much power. And you seem to care about these things, and that's why I'm writing to you. And I thought to myself, these people sound just like me. I'm not alone. There are at least 18,000 of us, and I wonder how many more there are. And because I'm a very bad statistician, but I love statistics. It's a very, very tragic way to be. But luckily, I know people who are good at statistics. So Robert and I sat down, and we decided to do an analysis of these emails. And we did this very sinister psychometric analysis thing that certain dodgy companies have been doing quite badly recently, and we did rather well. And we also measured it up against the World Values Survey to try and do an estimate of how many people in the world conformed to this world view. And we discovered that there's a definite character type. We call them natural cosmopolitans. I'm one, maybe some of you are one. And the interesting thing is that they represent, if you measure it very, very conservatively, no less than 10% of the world's population. So my co-founder and I, Madeline, we were sitting down talking about this about 2 years ago, thinking about that 10%. And my initial reaction was that 10% was a slightly disappointing number. But then the conversation started going in an interesting direction, because we said, well, actually 10% of the world's population, that's a very large number. That's 760 million people. And if we did want to do what these people seem to be asking, to do something about it, to work towards changing the culture of governance, to make this a world where companies and countries and people work together first and compete second, you'd need a really, really powerful player to do that. Not another NGO, not another campaigning organization, not another activist website, but something much more potent than that. And if you've got 760 million people, that's much bigger than any one of those kinds of organizations. 760 million people is a nation-sized group, actually a very large nation. In fact, if it was a nation, it would be the third largest nation on Earth after India and China. It would be more than double the size of the United States. That would be a force to be reckoned with. And then we talked a bit longer and we realized, actually, in a sense, it already is a nation. Because if you define a nation, as some have, as a group of people connected by a common culture, what more could you ask? The good country already exists. It's the third largest country on Earth. It happens not to have any territory, but who wants territory? Territory is a nuisance. As soon as you have territory, you need an army to defend it. I'd rather do without that. And anyway, who says that a nation or a country, if you want to call it a country, has to exist in one place and everybody has to live there? These people, by definition, have already got somewhere to live. They've got their home country. They don't need another place to live, but they do need another place to be. Because those 760 million people, they do have two sides to their brain and two sides to their heart. They have a commitment to their own country, and they have a commitment to humanity, and they want to express both of those politically, culturally, economically, behaviorally, and personally. And so they need dual nationality. They need to belong to their home country, which is where their society is, where their roots are, where they were born, where their ancestors possibly were born. But they also need another country that represents their commitment to humanity and to the planet. And dual citizenship is the only possible answer. And so because this is officially the age of crazy, and every morning we wake up and discover that another bizarre thing has happened in the international system, which 10 years ago would have been totally unthinkable, why not take advantage of that and do something that's totally unthinkable? Why not take advantage of that and make a virtual country and declare it a sovereign nation and make it one of the most powerful countries on earth and use it for good, because that's what its citizens all want and that's what brings them together. It is such a crazy age that I feel a certain impatience to get this done before things turn normal again. You never know. But right now we could do that. We've got the technology. We've got the acceptance from the general public. We have definitely got 760 million people, if not many, many, many more. And so what we're trying to do as of 3 or 4 weeks ago is to sign up as many of those people as we possibly can to become citizens of the good country. And they've started to sign up. It's not quite as amazing a story as the TED Talk, but within 24 hours we had people from 114 different countries signing up. And that was without any promotion. The word somehow leaked out. Now we're frantically trying to leak out the word as fast as we can because the thing is actually open and up and running. And this brings me almost to the conclusion, which is where I ask for your help, and if you want to leave, that's the time to do it. Almost. Because the last thing I want to do is just to very briefly describe how it actually works and what it's going to do, because you're probably wondering about that. People generally do. So the way that it actually works is that once we've got all of those citizens on board, and remember it is their second citizenship, we have a pretty cool technology platform which is called Remesh, which has been given to us by a company of the same name in New York. And it's an AI-based discussion platform which achieves a remarkable thing. It enables our citizens, no matter how many of them there are, to have a discussion together collectively. In other words, to become a self-organizing system. And that means, hurrah, we don't need a government. We don't need a government, we don't need leaders. We need a very small civil service, and our aim is to keep the civil service proportionally getting smaller and smaller as the country gets bigger and bigger. But it will never need leaders, and it will never need a government, because the citizens collectively decide what they're going to do next. And this is one area where technology does enable us to do something which hasn't been possible since the days of ancient Athens, where a democracy consisted of about 60 people. With the AI software, we can have 760 million people having a proper discussion in natural language in 28 different languages and deciding which challenges they want to tackle for that quarter. So we'll take on 4 challenges every year, quarter by quarter. Everything is done through this collective decision-making platform, and we will create those policies jointly with our citizens, and we will execute them ourselves. So we're not lobbying, we're not protesting, we're not campaigning, we're not making a noise, we're making a difference. We're acting like a sovereign state and let them try to stop us. Because one of the interesting things about having 760 million citizens is that if they're all paying taxes, we're also quite a rich country. In fact, the taxes that we're asking for are $5 a year, which is very reasonable. I think most people would actually quite like to leave their own country and come to the good country. Unfortunately, they can't do that yet. So the $5 are on top of whatever taxes they're paying at the moment. But as you all have already calculated in your minds, 760 million people paying $5 each gives us the equivalent of the GDP of Sierra Leone to spend every year on making the world a better place, without Sierra Leone's problems to have to spend it on. So we're in a very, very good situation to do that. And it means that we can use what the political scientists call economic hard power. We can buy out troublemakers. We can design and build and create and fund institutions. We can actually work directly to make the world work better. I could spend a day explaining the system and exactly how it works, but I think that's the general gist of things. And so here's to my request. Your country needs you. And I'm taking the risk of calling it your country because I have a sort of a hunch that if you've come to the Good Summit, then you might conceivably share some of the values that underpin it. The good country is only going to work if it's got a big population. It'll work well long before we get to 760 million. But we need probably about 1 million before people start really seriously paying attention. We are already hoping, long before we get to 1 million citizens, to exchange diplomats with 3 countries that we're speaking to at the moment, which is very exciting. So we'll have some kind of recognition as a state. We're not going after that hell for leather. It's not the most important thing, but it's very useful. We're already very good friends with 5 or 6 UN agencies. 3 of them have already given us projects that they would like us to carry out as soon as we've got the citizens to perform it. But we need to get to about 1 million before we can actually start operating and doing these things at the beginning of next year. So here's the request. I was going to say I don't want your $5. I actually do want your $5 because what I would really like all of you to do is to sign up and become citizens. It's the easiest thing in the world. It takes about 1 minute. You go on the website, which is www.good.country. You fill in the form, you sign up. I'm afraid it's credit cards only at the moment, but we're hoping to add PayPal. For some reason, that's very difficult. But it'll be along very shortly. And then once you're a citizen, or even before, oh, and by the way, if $5 is a problem, and $5 is a lot of money for a lot of people around the world, one of the things that we do is we allow citizens to voluntarily buy $5 bonds, as many as they like. And those go into a fund, which then enables us to offer free citizenship for the people who want to be citizens but can't afford the $5. We have a lot of students, we have a lot of people in developing countries, but also, I'm proud and pleased to say, some people from rich countries who also don't have $5. About 40% of our citizens have voluntarily paid more than $5 for their tax fee, so we've got a very good fund going at the moment. So I would like you to join, I would like you to pay the $5. If you can afford it, I would also like you to buy some bonds, and that helps us to give free citizenship to others. But the most important thing is that you send me an email, simon@good.country, if you'd like to help. Because what I'm trying to do here in Ireland, with the help of Kingsley and Jules and many other good people who met with us yesterday evening, is to see if we can get a network, an informal network of voluntary ambassadors working in Ireland. Ireland is special to the good country for so many different reasons. First of all, because it was the first goodest country. I say goodest, forgive me, but it's different from best. It's the best for the Irish, but not necessarily the best for the world. It's another question. Also because, as Kingsley was saying in his really interesting remarks earlier, it is so very cosmopolitan. It's unusually cosmopolitan, the number of people from different countries who live there. And that's very, very close to the fundamental meaning of the good country. We celebrate the fact that cultural diversity is what makes the world work. It's the reason why globalization is the best thing that's ever happened to humanity, because it stirs up the culture and creates more innovation, more excitement, more new things than humanity has ever been able to deal with before. And that's why a city like Dublin and a country like Ireland is pretty interesting to us. So that's it. If you are interested enough to feel that you might be able to devote some time, a few hours a week, $5, or just some ideas, some contacts, some connections, then please write to me. That email again, simon@good.country. I promise I will stay awake 18 hours a day if necessary to answer the emails. It may take a week or so, but we would really, really appreciate your help, and I would love to see a big chunk of the Irish population gaining that second citizenship sometime very soon. Thank you.